Hey everybody, thanks for joining me here today. Today's session is about eliminating high ISO noise with DeNoise 6. Whether you're traveling without a tripod, wanting to capture action shots, or just need to shoot handheld indoor photography, there are many times when you have to increase your ISO to capture what you want. But with Topaz DeNoise, you don't really have to worry about the noise that high ISO can cause. So today we're going to be taking a look at how to utilize DeNoise 6 specifically to remove image noise from your handheld photos. So today we're going to be taking a look at some handheld photography and some travel photography that was shot without using a tripod, so also handheld. Indoor photography sometimes is difficult to, especially if you're not using a flash, is difficult to capture and capture an in-focus image without raising your ISO to above where ideally you would want it, causing image noise to start showing up in your RAW or JPEG imagery. This is going to be the first image that we're taking a look at here. This is just a fun little photo shoot I did with my son last year, and this is the after image. The before image I'm going to pull up through Camera Raw because one very strong suggestion I have is to make sure that you start with Topaz DeNoise. If you edit your color, your contrast, your tones to any sort of large degree, not your overall tones, but any sort of contrast or detail work. If you have high ISO image noise, the tools that you're using to increase that detail and color is going to look at your noise like detail and increase the sharpness of those little image noise speckles and just make it that much harder to get out of your image. So be sure to use DeNoise at the beginning of your workflow. And so this, I wanted to show you the after image, but let's go ahead and pull up the beginning image. All right, so here is the original image. You can see I did crop it in the end and work on my composition, but again, I want to show you the full editing process and show you that beginning image where I started. By default, your Camera Raw and some of your other RAW processors may increase your detail and remove your image noise a little bit. So I always suggest that you hop on over to your detail tab within Camera Raw at least and take down your sharpening and your color noise reduction that's automatically applied. That way you can tell if there is image noise in your image that you need to reduce. Now here up at the top of the Camera Raw panel, you can see that I was at ISO 1600. So I automatically believe, okay, there is going to be some image noise. But that's what I needed to be at to capture an indoor handheld photography without flash. So let's go ahead and take a look at an area that most likely will have some image noise if it's in there. And I already start to see it. The image noise is going to look like little, basically digital grain, colorful grain, and it's usually not something that most of us want in our image. The good thing is DeNoise 6 is going to be able to take that out very quickly and work on even extreme amounts of high ISO noise. This one isn't an extreme case, but it's definitely an everyday case that I run into, so I want to go through this process with you. So again, without doing much work, contrast or detail work that is, I'm going to just do a little bit of tone work real quick and maybe take my shadows up just a touch, which is actually going to increase the visibility of that noise, but I want to take the shadows of his up, kind of open up his face a little bit more. This is okay to do because you're not really working with individual detail and highlighting the micro contrast or texture contrast. So I'm just opening up those shadows and blacks just a touch and maybe taking the exposure up just a little bit. And beyond that, I'm pretty happy. So let's go ahead and go into the DeNoise workflow. So I'm going to say open image. It's going to open it into Photoshop. At this point, I like to make a copy of my background layer by pressing Control-J. It's Command-J on a Mac. And I'm just going to label this DeNoise over here on the right-hand side in the Layers panel. Just to give you a quick recap of the camera information, I was using a Canon EOS 5D Mark II at a f2.8 aperture and ISO of 1600. The reason that's important is within the Topaz DeNoise 6 upgrade that we recently had, we have camera-specific profiles that I've created for you, or that we've created for you. And they're fairly accurate. I'm pretty happy with them, actually. So instead of going in and starting from a preset that isn't necessarily specific to your camera or the settings that you used, or coming over to the manual side and really working heavily there, if you see your camera profile within camera DeNoise 6, usually you can just click on that and you're going to see some great results. We are going to go through this manual process as well, but just to give you an idea of how quickly this can work, I'm going to come over here to a somewhat noisy area. You really see that image noise coming through his cheek over here and on the shadow area of his eyes and on the bridge of his nose over here near the corner of his eye. So again, I was using an EOS 5D Mark II at 1600. I'm going to go into the Canon category here and see if I have that. And here it is. Click right there. Wait until it finishes processing. And very quickly, I was able to eliminate the majority of that noise. It did soften it up just a touch, so I'd probably do a little bit of detail work on the manual side. These camera profiles are not exact to all of our sensors, but it's a really great starting point. Let me show you what that did. I'm going to go into our Luma area and show you the before. Here's before with our contrast noise, the Luma. I go into our color category. Here's before. This is how much color noise we were dealing with prior to clicking on that preset, and this is after. So it does a lot of great work right at the beginning. However, I do want to show you the full manual processes of eliminating this high ISO noise. So I'm going to go ahead and press Reset All and get back to my default noise reduction, which is no noise reduction whatsoever. With DeNoise, one of the most important things to know about are your preview modes. This makes it very specific for noise reduction channels, so you can isolate different types of image noise and work on just that type of noise during that particular step in the process. This makes it much easier to get your noise reduction while still preserving and actually extracting image detail so you get the best results possible. By default, it opens up into RGB preview mode, which is your color normal RGB preview mode. This mode is good for a few of the sliders, but the majority of them will use one of the other preview modes. I like to go into my Luma preview mode first and view just my contrast noise. The contrast noise is going to kind of look like little contrasty points of, it looks like grain in a black and white image, but in a color RGB image, it kind of looks like color grain. But within the Luma, you can see all this little contrast, little speckles here. To highlight those a little bit easier so you can view them easier, we have something called an auto brighten preview. By default, it's turned off, but if you go to normal and it doesn't lighten up, you might go to strong, you'll start to see that it brightens up your image, and this is just for the noise reduction process. This doesn't actually apply back to your main image when you press OK and go back into Photoshop, but it allows for you to view that noise that much better so you can remove it without over softening it. While in your preview or your Luma preview mode, that is where the overall strength within the noise reduction tab is going to be best seen. The overall strength is your main noise reduction slider. It's going to affect all of these other specific noise reduction sliders below it. So without the overall strength, none of these other sliders will work. So you do need to take the overall strength up. When you're taking your overall strength and reducing the noise, you want to focus on an area that has midtones only. If you can find an area of your image that has shadows, highlights, and midtones, that's best, so you don't have to move the navigator around, because that's going to take into consideration all the different tones in your image. And this does a pretty good job. I have a highlight over here on the bridge of his nose and the capture light in his eyes. I have shadows within the eyes and face, and then some midtones as well on the face. So here I'm going to take my overall strength up, focusing on the midtones of his cheek right here. When it starts to get to a point where it smooths out and reduces that noise, I'm going to move on to my adjust shadow. The adjust shadow is going to just work on the shadow noise that might be still showing up within the shadows of your image. Image noise tends to be more apparent within your shadow regions of your image and less apparent in the highlights, and that's why denoise gives you the ability to go in and manually change just those areas, because if you're taking the overall strength up to affect your shadows and remove all the shadow noise, you're going to end up over softening your midtones and way over softening your highlights. So that's why we say when you look at the overall strength, only focus on your midtones and then go in and manually adjust your shadows to maybe take out a little bit more image noise. I'm looking at the shadows underneath his eyes and in the pupils and just getting a little bit more reduction there. Looks pretty good. And now with the highlight slider below that, I'm going to focus on the capture light in his eyes and a little bit of the bridge of his nose on the left side of our screen. And I'm actually going to take that down. Right now I feel like I've over softened a lot of those highlights. I'm going to bring back some of the detail and crisp up those highlight edges. And you can see within the catch light, it definitely increased that back to the original detail. So here's before and here's after. It's still a little bit soft for me, so I'm going to take this overall strength down to about 0.08 instead and see if that works a little bit better. Here's before and after, and that's looking pretty good. We've gone through the Luma preview mode sliders, what I like to use when I'm in the Luma mode, which is the overall strength, shadow, and highlight. When you get down to the adjust color red, that's a big old clue to hop into a red preview mode, which is up here in your preview mode area. So just click on the red preview mode to pull that channel up, and that's going to show you your red channel noise. So here's before. Remember when I said that the overall strength actually affected all the rest of these channels because it's working on your overall noise, including your chroma and your luma noise, which is your color and your contrast noise. So even though we haven't worked specifically on our color noise yet, it already is reduced a nice amount. You can tell because what looked like really sharp little points of detail have now softened up and started to blend in with each other. And you want to continue that goal of blending in those little points of contrast into a smooth tone. I suggest looking at your midtones, so maybe around the cheek area, something that doesn't have a lot of detailed lines. Smooth midtone areas are best when looking at this preview mode. And then take your adjust color red up until you start to smooth out certain areas and you start to see a little bit of a pattern. If you continue to see just a little bit of a pattern but it looks a lot smoother than it did originally, I say you're pretty good and move on from there. You don't want to take out too much or blend too much color together. The next slider is the adjust color blue. We also have a preview mode blue, so that's when I suggest you go into that preview mode blue whenever you're working on that adjust color blue slider. Here's before, all the work that we've done, and here's after. So we've done quite a bit of work within this blue channel as well, but I still see a lot of contrast happening and a lot of splotches of tones, so I'm going to increase that blue slider to start seeing some reduction there as well. And it's starting to smooth out. I still see some patterns going on there, but I'm okay at this point. The next slider is our clean color slider. The clean color slider will allow you to kind of perfect the color noise reduction process. For that, I go into my preview mode color, and that's going to show you your overall color that you have within the image and remove any of the detail or luma noise that you were looking at before. So it's just showing color information. It looks pretty good. Let's see what it looked like before. So this is where we started with a lot of little splotches of high contrast color. And by working with the overall strength, the adjust color red and adjust color blue, we've definitely smoothed out a lot. However, if you scroll into the image, it's very subtle, but you'll see that there's still these larger splotches that's smoothed out, but still larger splotches of magenta that's going into kind of a yellow color. The clean color is just going to clean this up and smooth it out that much more, allowing for any large, hazy areas of color noise that are left over to be removed and reduced. So you can see by taking that clean color slider up, those large splotchy areas have been smoothed into the rest, and it looks much better. At this point, you come to your correct black level slider. The correct black level slider is interesting. It is something that it is a slider that will bring back the original shadow tones into the shadow areas. When you're dealing with very high ISO noise, you tend to have this kind of hazy fog that is over your shadow areas after the noise reduction. So especially if you're working with something that maybe is ISO 3200, 6400, you might see a little bit of extra haziness, and that's where the correct black level slider really comes in, and we're going to see that within the next workflow. For this one, it's not really evident, but let me take that down to 0. Let's see if we can see any difference as it goes up to 1. If it's not in there, it's not going to affect it too much. It just increased the shadow tone just a tiny, tiny bit. That means that really there was nothing to remove. There was no haziness to kind of combat there. All right, so here's where we are right now. Here's before and after. Let me show you that in a more detailed area of the image so you can tell if it's been smoothed out. And we're going to go a little bit more into the image here. Here's before. You can see all the noise within the iris, within his eye, and within his eyelash area here where it's a little bit darker over here on the top left within the shadow area underneath his hat. And it has been removed now. I also see that some of the detail has been removed though, and that's where the detail recovery comes in. Detail recovery I like to look at either within my Luma mode or within RGB. It's kind of a preference. I'm going to go into my Luma mode and leave it at the off brighten preview. I don't want to brighten it up, and I'm going to work with my recover detail there. Recover detail is going to bring back the original image detail without bringing back the image noise. Here's before, here's after. Look at that. Here's before and after. Almost no softening can be seen. The reduced blur is a little bit trickier. It's something that is really great for highly detailed images because it's going to crisp up the lines of your image. You might want to be careful of overusing this particular slider when you're dealing with things like portraits or something that has a lot of smooth areas. However, going up to at least 0.1 or so will crisp up your image, especially if you have some detail softening that's still happening. And it's very subtle, but it does magic, especially with detailed images. Here's before and after. And the last slider I have a lot of questions about all the time, which is the add grain slider. Add grain is going to do what it says. It's going to add grain back into your image. A lot of you might be saying, but wait, I thought we just took out all of this graininess in the image. Well, that's image noise. Image noise is going to look very inconsistent, and some larger, some smaller. The thing about image noise is sometimes it gives you the illusion of detail within your image when it's not even there. So even whenever you go through the noise reduction process, you remove the noise and you recover the detail, your image might still have a tiny bit of softening in it because of that reduction of that graininess that's in your image. The add grain slider is going to add a very, very small grain back into your image, and it's all going to be very similar sized, and it just gives you that illusion of detail that the digital noise gave your image, but without looking like digital noise. This is fantastic for a noise reduction process where you think in the end, especially with portraits, the skin might be looking a little plastic, over smoothing might be happening, and you can't quite figure out why, this add grain detail slider is going to be awesome. So here's before. Let me get this to an area maybe where we can see a little bit more effective. You really can see within the eye itself. So this is before, and we're going to take that up quite high. After. So it just crisps everything up and gives you that detail. Now overall before and after within my Luma channel. And let me go back to my RGB. Here's before. Look at all the graininess that's happening within his eye, all the color splotches, and now after. It's cleaned up and lovely. I'm going to come over here as well into the really shadow area. Here's before and after. If you don't like that monochromatic, very, very fine grain that's added, you can always take it out or reduce it. It's a little heavy here in my shadow area, so I'm just going to reduce it. I still get very natural results. I'm going to say OK. And that is a standard high ISO noise reduction process that I use almost every time I have a handheld, indoor, natural light portrait or photo session like this. This does not take into consideration the debanding tab. Our next workflow will. Banding noise is a little bit different. We looked at contrast noise and chroma noise in this particular workflow. Banding noise is going to look like long, thin lines of colorful noise that goes across your image, and I'll show that to you in here in 1 second. Let's show you the before and after going up a little bit closer. This is after. Here's before. You can see all of that colorful splotchiness coming in the shadows. And after. And now I'm able to move on with a nice clean image, and I can add detail and get detail enhancements exactly where I want them without increasing detail of the noise or detracting from my subject at all. Well, I was going to look at this image, which does show a significant amount of noise within our shadows, and you can see it right here. I might come back to this image, but just for fun, I had an image of the same building taken about an hour after this, and it is a ton of noise, and it really shows the power of denoise, which I think a lot of people want to see. So I want to show you that really quickly if I can find it. Okay, let's go back. There it is. This is a significant amount of noise. This is still using the Canon 5D Mark II, but the ISO is 25,600. And here you can see every type of noise you possibly can. This isn't the best image. I didn't have a tripod. I was actually kind of shooting this in hopes that I would have an example to show later on with Topaz DeNoise how powerful it really can be, and I'm happy to do that today. So let me go ahead and press Control-J, and I'm going to scroll in just to show you the heaviness of the noise. So here you can see the dramatic color noise that's happening, especially in the shadows. It looks like confetti. And oops, let's get rid of that. Down here at the bottom, you can start to see banding noise. And again, I said that, if you remember, I told you banding noise looks like long, colorful strings of noise versus just splotches. They start to create this line pattern. And that's the best way I can describe it. It's not super evident, but once you see it, you'll know that it's in there. It kind of crisscrosses either horizontally or vertically across your image. You can really see it over here. The blocks just start to come together to create these lines, and that is the most difficult type of noise to get rid of because it's just so imprinted on that image. Denoise can handle this beautifully. So let's go ahead and jump on in. Now again, I want to start with the presets that were created for this specific camera profile and ISO setting, just to show you how you might do this in a very quick way without going into the noise reduction process and how you can just kind of clean up what the preset starts off with. But here's the original. Oh, let me reset all here. Here's the original in RGB preview mode, and I would go to EOS 5D Mark II ISO 25600 and click that. Wait for my results. Okay, so several things happened here. Number one, the color noise is gone. It's awesome. The color noise is great. The inconsistent contrast noise with all of the different size pieces of contrast noise is gone. I do have a much more consistent, small monochromatic grain going on, so I think in my head, okay, there's a lot of add grain happening here, maybe too much. And there's also a severe darkening of some of my colors, especially those blacks. And I'm not sure if you remember, but the correct black level slider within the noise reduction tab is going to be the cause of this. So if you see that, when you're working with your camera and you have gotten to a stage, even if you're going manually, and if you're worked with your overall strength and it's super high and all of your adjustments are super high and everything starts to become green or too blocked up in your shadows, it's that correct black level slider. So I'm just going to take this correct black level slider down and see what starts happening. Ooh, okay, so it did brighten up and get more green in there, but it still looks green to me. Here's before. The before in my shadows, especially on the bottom within the bushes, looks a little bit more magenta, and now I'm going really green. So I'm going to take that down even farther, and maybe just at 0.04. Ah, there we go. Here's before and after. I still see some nice shadows. I might be able to take that up just a little tiny bit more until I start seeing a little bit too much green coming through, and then I'll take it back down. And that's how I would work with the black really blocking up. Now I have been able to bring that black back closer to the original color. At this point, looking at what I'm working with here, let's go up maybe right about here. This has a nice amount of noise, or a nice amount of detail coming through. Here's before, here's after. I think it's done a fairly remarkable job of removing everything, but I am missing some of the detail within, it is softening it just a bit for me. So for my personal taste, I would go to detail recovery and take my detail up even further. I'm going to stay in this RGB mode because this is what I would do if I was working with a preset first. I might take my reduce blur up just a touch. And that add grain is a little heavy. I'm seeing a little too much of that graininess coming through, so I'm just going to take that down, making sure that this isn't having negative effects on my image either. And it's not. So here's before, here's after. I've taken a completely unusable image and made it somewhat usable. It's still a very it's not the best image, but it was to kind of show you the example of how much noise you really are able to take away while still keeping image quality at the top of the mind. Let's go ahead and reset all of this and walk through this manually really quickly. So when I'm dealing with this much image noise, the first thing I like to do is look at the noise and decide if I have banding noise. The debanding tab is only for use when you see it. Don't use debanding noise reduction if you don't see debanding noise in your image, or banding noise within your image, I'm sorry. If you use it and you don't have banding noise, it's going to introduce these weird kind of lines in a pattern across your image that you are not going to like. But if you do see banding noise, like we do down here in the bottom, you can come through and just click on the type of noise you see. I see both horizontal and vertical. It's going to remove that. And now I can show you, here's before. It's a very, very subtle grid and now here's after. Let me go up to super shadowy area. Let's see if we can see it better there. Here's before. So you can see right across the middle here and consistently across and vertically in my image there's some banding noise, and after it has been reduced. Alright, so now that I've clicked on my debanding work, real quick, the banding width of 20, that's the default amount, is going to be the best. We did a ton of testing here at Topaz whenever we were introduced this debanding tab, and 20 is 99.9% of the time going to be the best setting for your banding noise reduction. If for some reason you have real thick noise lines or thinner than normal, taking that to the left or to the right will work with different varying thicknesses of banding noise. But again, just pay attention and make sure that you're not actually introducing any sort of lines into your image with this. I find 20 default works almost every time. At this point, I'm going to search out an area that has shadow, highlights, and midtones. And for me, that's going to be probably right down here, kind of looking into the lobby. I have midtones back here on the wall and on the ground. In front of me, I have, not in front of me, but in the foreground of the image. I wish this was in front of me right now. I have highlights on the lights on the building and some of the reflections on the metal, and a lot of shadows to work with. So at this point I'm ready to start my reduction process, and I'm going to hop into my Luma mode, go into my noise reduction, and take my auto brighten up to normal or strong. I think I'm going to leave it at normal. Normal allows me to really see the shadow noise and the midtone noise, but doesn't start taking my highlights up too high where I can no longer see that noise. I like to see noise within all tones. So now that I have my brighten preview where I want it and I'm in the Luma preview mode, I'm going to start with my overall strength. I know just by looking at this that this has to go very high. I would probably take this to about 0.8. I still see some interesting patterns going on in my midtones, but I don't want to take this all the way up until I've worked with the rest of my noise reduction to see if some of that is handled through these sliders below. I'm also going to do something that happens whenever I take my overall strength up really high. I like to go and take my correct black level slider down to 0 and work with the shadow tone restoration at the end of my workflow. Otherwise, I'm dealing with some shadow blocking up in the Luma channel that is caused by that correct black level slider. And again, that only happens when my overall strength goes up really high like this, but it's just a little tip that if you take that correct black level slider down, you won't see that kind of odd dark splotches in the shadows, and you can really start to manipulate the shadows in a better way. So I'm going to take my shadow reduction up, focusing on just my shadow areas, and that's definitely smoothed out. I still see some splotchiness again, but that might be coming from some of my color channels, so I want to stop right about there. Again, I can come back up and always continue to manipulate after I've worked through this whole process. I'm going to take my adjust highlight down, really focusing on the little twinkle lights on the trees, some of the lights on the building itself, bringing back some of that detail. Okay, so here's before. This is just the contrast noise, and here's after. We have removed a ton. Because there's so much noise and there was so much contrast noise to remove, I definitely see some detail that has been lost, but I know I can get that back within my detail recovery slider. So I'm going to continue on into my color channels now. Adjust color red. I'll go into my red color preview mode. Here's before. This is what we started with. Here is what has been removed so far. And it's actually a good amount that's been removed. I'm going to focus on the smooth areas down here on the ground, maybe in my foreground, and take that up so I start seeing a smoothing or an overall pattern. That looks pretty good. Now I'm going to go into my blue preview mode. Here was our blue noise. This is after, and it's almost perfect. I do see a little splotchiness, so I'll take that up just a bit. Smooth it out that much more. Okay, that looks pretty good. And now I'm going to go into my preview mode color. Here was just my color noise before we started with our process. Here's after. It looks pretty good, but if you look hard, you can see that within the areas that are smooth, there's some splotches of magenta and kind of haziness that's still left over in those large areas. So I'm just going to take that clean color slider up until it starts to smooth out, which it just did, blending in really nicely with each other. And now when I get down to my correct black level, I will go back into my RGB preview mode. The first thing I notice is that I still see a lot of little artifacts and kind of what I call squiggly lines, or worminess happening. And that's because I still have a significant amount of noise that is still there, or at least trying to repair itself and not doing a very good job. So I'm going to take this overall strength up all the way and see what happens. Oh, that's better. It's still there though, but I can combat that with some of my detail sliders and actually get a usable result. When you're dealing with an ISO of 25,600, majority of the time you're just trying to get to a usable image, not a perfect quality image. It's kind of hard, but we're going to do our best. With correct black level, I would start taking this up, but keeping in mind that my overall strength is all the way up at 1. I know I'll immediately see too much shadow restoration being brought back, so I'm just going to take that back down until it's a more realistic shadow tone. There we go, that works. Here's before and after. Now at this point I go into my detail recovery. Whenever you go into your detail recovery, you want to turn the auto brighten off so you have a good indication of what you're going to be viewing, and then hop on into your detail recovery. I'm going to get back to a good place to look at detail for me, and let's recover some detail. I'm going to take that up pretty high because we've removed quite a bit, and I see immediately a sharpening of edges and a nice amount of detail recovery. Unfortunately, in my smooth areas where there is no detail to recover, because this is where we started off, I start to see that worminess again. This is the tab where you can kind of combat that with that add grain slider. As you add grain, it's not only going to give you the illusion of detail, as I was talking to you about prior to this, but also going to mask some of those wormy artifacts, which is a nice side benefit there. This is a time when I wouldn't touch the reduce blur. And the only reason is reduce blur, let's go back to 200. Let me just show you what it will do. If you've recovered your detail like this and you have these very significant wormy artifacts after recovering those details, if you reduce your blur even on top of that, it's only going to enhance that, because it's looking and it's trying to find the lines within your image and just kind of crisp them up. And when doing that, it's going to find those little lines that look like detail and crisp those up too. So when you're doing a very, very high amount of noise removal followed by a significant amount of recovering of your detail, you'll want to avoid that reduced blur. Now I'm going to take this add grain up again, and it's just going to give me that nice monochromatic grain that can actually heighten the amount of detail that is seen within the image. Here's before. Here's after. I would most likely play around with this a little bit more and try to get a little bit better of a result, especially for my midtones, but I think this gives you a great idea about how much noise and how high you really can go with your ISO and still have confidence that denoise can handle that reduction process. If you have any questions that we weren't able to get to, you can contact us at webinars@topazlabs.com. All of the new features in Topaz DeNoise 6, including camera profiles, batch processing, any of the new any of the new features and an overall overview of Topaz DeNoise 6 can be found on our YouTube channel at youtube.com/topazlabs. They're under 5-minute videos where you can really get to know Topaz DeNoise even further. If you are interested in signing up for upcoming sessions, you can do so at topazlabs.com/webinars. And thank you so much for joining us here today. I hope this gave you a good idea on how to eliminate high ISO image noise using Topaz DeNoise 6. I hope you're able to join us next week, and have a great week. Bye-bye.